Hello and welcome to the Weisman Museum. I'm artist Gudrun Lock, and this is the Target Studio for Creative Collaborations. Installed here is a project that I've been working on for over 2.5 years, which focuses on the marginal buffers of an intermodal train and trucking site in Northeast Minneapolis. I use this installation as a storytelling tool to reanimate these mundane spaces and share this project and our ideas with scientists, researchers, other artists, and the public. So it all began when I watched a film about a woman called Diana Beresford Kroger, who claims to be a descendant of Druids and is also a botanist. She spoke about how trees, the aerosols that are released from trees, affect our brain chemistry, and also how forests, even at a great distance, affect the health of waterways. So after I finished the film, I took my dog out for a walk along this 27th Avenue border of Shoreham Yards. And I thought, a forest should be here. The margins have always been of interest to me, whether I'm making photography or sculpture or publicly engaged art. And the reason why is because it delineates the sort of limits of progress. And also because I get bored with the assumption that the way things are is somehow natural or inevitable or desired. And also the margins allow for the possibilities of other rules and ways to dream. So even while there are limitations, and even while it's often chaotic and disorderly, I'm interested in those dreams. So this idea of planting a forest on 27th Avenue led me to make some inquiries. I emailed multiple times Canadian Pacific that owns Shoreham Yards. I also spoke to local governmental officials and community members. And I did a lot of reading online about things like the history of pollution at this site. There's a public repository of documents that includes chemicals that they have found, the use of this site for over 140 years, and also some of those cleanup efforts. And so while the perimeter that I have been walking really is mundane and very ordinary looking, there's a whole, of course, history of displacement, colonization, extraction, global financial interests that have played out over time, allowing this to develop, right? Displacing people, displacing communities, and replacing them with this singular narrative of progress. And what I'm interested in, again, are these margins where the sort of refuse of that narrative end up, right? This is what I'm interested in exploring because it tells us something about what is missing and what is produced by this type of activity. And maybe it's time that we start to pay attention and listen. Another thing I learned when reading about this site is that it's part of the Mississippi watershed. So Shoreham Yards exists half a mile away from the Mississippi River, and all the water moves downhill, right? This is where Minneapolis gets its drinking water. This is also part of Audubon's special bird areas corridor for migration of great herons and egrets and cormorants. But it is also, while maybe it looks beautiful here, it's also stinky. It smells really bad because of things like the Gaff Shingle factory that has a history tied back to Standard Oil. Or Northern Metals scrapyard, for instance, that is owned by a British company. So these particulates and this stink move through predominantly African American communities, affecting families over time, and also smelling up the river. So Monday through Friday, it's not the nicest. Another thing that happens when we focus on this singular narrative of progress is that it predetermines how we might know, how we might understand the world, and how we might think of ourselves in relation to other species and natural systems. This display here uses specimens from the Bell Museum of Natural History, which has a particular model of knowing, which includes segregating specimens out of their entanglement with the natural world, counting every single hair, stuffing them, and putting them on display as a way to know nature. Another thing that I've included in this display here are found objects that I've gleaned from the perimeter of Shoreham Yards. Some of them are things like conglomerate rocks that trouble the boundary between human and non-human. Eventually, of course, these will be broken down and transformed by the body of Mother Nature and turned into soil and dirt. These species of animals have all been found on the site. I've seen them and witnessed them and talked to them personally. And also they live in this area that includes these types of materials, garbage and waste that has been left behind after industry moves on. These plant specimens here I collected from this dump site that we'll talk about next. They are all invasive species, and when I looked them up and read about them on something called MinnesotaWildflower.org, they have incredibly aggressive language that says things like eradicate immediately. What I'm interested in with these species is to potentially reconsider the way that we describe these things, especially because some of these I have witnessed native bees using as food. And the other thing is that these types of sites represent our future. These plants live in highly disturbed areas. They live in poor soil, in waste zones. These are the types of words that are used to describe their neighborhoods. Also, the Minnesota Department of Transportation brought in many of these species specifically to try to deal with erosion problems. We are all entangled with the histories that have come before us, and we may have to figure out how to live with the results. These here are bird notes taken through excursions with Dave Zumeta, who is a retired Department of Natural Resources forester. He was very surprised by how many species we found. We went on 14 trips, and while the trains are moving and the exhaust fumes are spewing and the noises are occurring on the train yard, we witnessed 80 different species of birds, some of whom are using the site for nesting. Here we see some underpants on display, fruit of the loom, men's medium. We used these in a soil test experiment that was measuring bacterial and fungal levels and the relative activity of them over time in different soils around the perimeter of Shoreham Yards. This is a close-up of the Sioux Line dump, which makes up the northern section of the train yard, one of its many buffers. And through the reading and investigation I did, I discovered that this whole area up top, which is currently a golf course, was actually a lake called Sandy Lake. And when in the late 1800s, the lakes in South Minneapolis were dredged in order to produce recreation areas for the more wealthy, that material was brought to Northeast Minneapolis and dumped in Lake Sandy, filling it. They always have flooding in this area, not surprisingly, because really it wants to be a wetland. The southern edge of Sandy Lake actually reaches down through here, which is the dump site. So this was an active dump site from the 1880s to the 1980s. It was filled with brick, wood, petroleum products, possibly creosote from some creosote activities on the west side of Shoreham Yards. And what occurred over time was a need to remediate. The Minnesota Pollution Control Agency and Canadian Pacific worked together to figure out a plan, which includes a cap over all of that waste, which is permeable, I recently discovered. And the reason why it's permeable is because it's housed on a peat bog, and peat produces methane. If you don't allow it to escape, it will explode. Another reason why there's this permeability is because this body of land wants to be a wetland. So it heaves and moves with fluctuations of water input. Therefore, that cap had to be permeable. This whole area has, again, this kind of language around it similar to these invasive species of waste zone, highly disturbed site, poor soils, right? But in fact, I have found multiple different species using this site as refuge and also as a sort of life source. So multiple pollinators, both invasive but mainly native, multiple plant species, also native and invasive, but in addition, deer, a badger, a coyote, what else have I seen? Gopher. They're all making this place their home. And they're butting right up against this active golf course and this active train yard. This, again, is this perimeter, this margin, this buffer that has actually active, diverse biological life. And one of my hopes with this project is to rethink these types of areas as areas that are worth supporting, as areas that have value, right? Previously seen as valueless, but also as areas that, again, mark the landscape that we will have to deal with in our future. Ones that are highly disturbed, ones that include toxicity. How are we going to learn to live with that? One of the important things I've found on the margins of this train yard are animal holes, numerous animal holes. And what I've realized, of course, is that we exclude them from living everywhere else. So they aren't allowed in our parks, they aren't allowed in our backyards. We capture them, we kill them, we displace them from their homes. Meanwhile, they do extremely important work of filtering water and allowing for the process of soil regeneration. As I was examining these holes and documenting them, taking photographs, trying to uncover who lives here so that I could write my list, so that I could explain the value of the site through the species that I've found, I realized that I was trespassing in their territory. So when I was digging up the underpants and interrupted a coyote who ran away and stepped on the badger's home as well as that of the ground-dwelling bees, I realized that in fact I was the trespasser and that I was being very privileged in my actions, assuming that I could explore this area and invade their homes while taking a photograph of myself doing it and assume that I was causing no harm. In fact, it was a righteous act and very assumption-filled. So going along with the animal holes, there's also a great collection of fungi that live on this site. This one here, the oyster mushroom, goes for $17.99 a pound at the local co-op and was being actively foraged, I noticed. The process of transformation that these fungi take part in, again, is fundamental to natural cycles of degeneration and regeneration. Just as we allow or we ignore the fact that ground-dwelling species use this site, fungi proliferate because we also don't manicure this landscape. So another benefit of being on the periphery, sort of out of sight and out of context of the regular laws of control and order, fungi allow for this process, the full life cycle, to occur. The eastern bluebird takes advantage of that as they require rotten trees to live in. Part of this collage that I made included with these animal holes and fungi are some pollution documents that describe the pollution that infects the entire groundwater system of Northeast Minneapolis. These are some found objects that I found on the site, including the Policing the Police DVD from the Hennepin County Library, and some evidence of someone sleeping the night on the perimeter of Shoreham Yards. Included along this edge here are pollution mitigation efforts, including this pump that sucks out the gases from 100 years of toxicity by a previous tenant. Included in this pollution area is this plume of volatile organic compounds that has poisoned the water, the groundwater, not our drinking water, but the groundwater of Northeast Minneapolis. And thousands of pounds of this volatile organic compound has been pumped out of this groundwater in an effort to clean it up. It's almost complete at this stage. This is our wall of underpants. A group of us went out and buried underpants 3 inches deep for 2 months around the perimeter of Shoreham Yards to test bacterial and fungal activity. I got this idea from a project through the University of Oregon where they're encouraging farmers to bury underpants in order to know the living soil of their farm fields. And there are some great photographs of giant farming men with extra large degraded underpants in their hands and big smiles on their faces. Here are some more found objects that I discovered on the edge of Shoreham Yards, including taconite, which comes from the Iron Range and is transported around the nation to refineries, turning it into steel for use in all of our developments. So this is where I found the taconite and the book. If you want to hop a train to anywhere in the country, you have to walk up here to the Burlington Northern Santa Fe line, and it will take you out of Minneapolis on the back roads. Here's a photograph that references this area that becomes not only a dump site of waste by industry, but also by locals, right? These kinds of marginal spaces gather the dust, so to speak, of our daily activity and often end up being collection zones for the layers of leftovers that we accumulate. But right next to it, as you can see, there is a community garden and multiple pollinator species capable of living and potentially even thriving right next to this waste area. This is an example of the kind of soil that is found on site. So Northeast Minneapolis is actually existing on a 30,000-year-old sand shelf, but additionally industrial materials are and residue is left over. Dust from the site affects local neighbors, where winds can become very strong and dust moves through the area at high speeds. Near this, we buried a pair of underpants that were dyed by a local crabapple tree. Over here is the west side of Shoreham Yards. This includes Department of Transportation corridor, where trees like this, wrapped in hardware cloth, have been managing on these extremely intense landscapes, but thriving all the same. One of our group's actions, we hope, will be to pull off this hardware cloth this spring in an act of interspecies solidarity. So this wall includes a shot of the west side and also these photographs here by artist Jeffrey Skemp that I commissioned in order to include in the exhibition, but also are part of an ongoing conversation about creating portraits of non-human species. Over here we see an aerial photograph taken in 1938 of this west side of Shoreham Yards. Included in this image are stacks of wood that were dunked in pentachlorophenol cut with thick diesel fuel. This pentachlorophenol was in 2 vats back to back, 150 feet long each. The sides were actually only soil, the bottom was concrete. And from 1915 to 1972, this wood was dunked in this solution in order to stop it from rotting. These are our utility poles that we see all around the Midwest. Important about this, I think, is when I learned that the pentachlorophenol, which actually wants to be a solid, fell over time 200 feet deep and basically reorganized itself as a solid. The diesel fuel, of course, leached into this landscape over time. The Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, the Department of Agriculture, and Canadian Pacific together, not that they did the digging, of course, but removed 12 to 14 feet of that soil, shipped it off to multiple places, including somewhere in Kansas, Peoria, Illinois, and I believe Duluth, Minnesota. And the point of this story to me is not only that the living earth is this consuming, belching, boiling, digesting body, but also that the pollution that we produce doesn't actually ever leave us. It just goes somewhere else. And to me, this is not responsible, nor is it the answer to our polluted environments. Part of this project has included the work of many collaborators: artists, researchers, scientists, community members. Hallie Bond is an artist who read pollution documents that are publicly accessible online from the 1980s to the present and recreated this Sioux Line dump. Jeffrey Scamp is a photographer that worked in medium format to create these portraits of trees after conversations about the interests and highlighting the needs of non-human species. Leslie Grant is an artist who has dug through the Historical Society, or the Minnesota Historical Society's archives, and looked at the Sioux Line dump, which includes boxes and boxes of files, some of which are focused on Shoreham Yards. In addition, arborist Chad Giblin produced a tree survey for us along this southern edge of Shoreham Yards in order to elaborate the existing species, existing diversity, because part of this project is learning how to support what already lives there, what already uses these sites, and not to imagine some ideal landscape that we have in our minds, but to support something that is existing and functioning. And then to introduce and support massive amounts of diversity in order to potentially undo the problems that invasive species can create, and also to support diverse life forms. Dave Zumeta has helped us with bird surveys and bird research, and the collaborations continue with locals, researchers, artists, and so on. I want to be clear that I'm not suggesting that nature is benign, that if we just love it, it will love us in return. But what I would like to pay attention to is how our standard way of learning and knowing that suggests objectivity in the form of species collection or data production or even mapping, that they reinforce this idea of separability, as if we are not completely enmeshed and entangled with the natural world. These marginal spaces are our future. And I would like to encourage you to ask yourself what type of future we should imagine.